I was desperate for work when I joined Sterling Tech. My fiancé and I were expecting our first child, and every dollar mattered. The job wasn't glamorous, just an assistant role, but it was stable, and stability was something I craved. The office was a sleek, polished place filled with sharp-dressed professionals typing away on high-tech gadgets. I tried to blend in, wearing my best clothes that were already starting to feel snug over my growing belly. My boss, Mr. Randall, was everything I hoped he wouldn't be: arrogant, dismissive, and impatient. From the very first day, he made it clear that he didn't think much of me. "Try to keep up, Rachel," he barked during my first team meeting. I swallowed my pride and nodded, focusing on the notes I was scribbling. I kept my pregnancy a secret at first. I knew how these things went. Pregnant women were often seen as liabilities in the corporate world. But the days stretched into weeks, and hiding my growing belly became impossible. One morning, I came in wearing a loose cardigan, but even that couldn't disguise the telltale curve of my stomach. Mr. Randall noticed. He didn't say anything outright, but his eyes narrowed and his lips twisted in what I could only describe as disdain. It started subtly. He'd assign me tasks that required me to stay late, knowing I couldn't. "Oh, you can't? Must be the baby brain," he said with a smirk when I told him I couldn't work past 6. The comments grew bolder over time. "Don't lift that file, Rachel. We wouldn't want you to strain yourself," he'd say loudly enough for the whole office to hear, his voice dripping with mock concern. The others laughed nervously, unsure of whether to join in or stay silent. One day, during a team lunch, he made a snide remark that stung like a slap. "You know, Rachel, it's interesting. Some people focus on their careers, and some, well, they prioritize other things." I bit my tongue, forcing back the tears. I couldn't afford to lose this job. Despite everything, I stayed. I had to. My fiancé, Mike, worked 2 jobs already, and we couldn't risk losing our apartment. I buried myself in my work, doing everything I could to prove my worth. One afternoon, I was called into Mr. Randall's office. My heart sank. He rarely summoned me unless he wanted to humiliate me in private. "I've got an important investor meeting tomorrow," he began, not even looking up from his computer. "You'll set it up, handle the logistics, and—" He finally glanced at me, his face twisting in a smirk. "Try not to embarrass me. Investors don't like distractions." I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from saying something I'd regret. That evening, I worked late to make sure everything was perfect. The conference room was spotless, the presentation flawless. It was exhausting, but I wanted to prove, at least to myself, that I could handle it. The next morning, the investor arrived. He was an older gentleman, sharp-eyed and impeccably dressed. As he walked in, I froze. "Dad?" I whispered, barely audible. My father stopped mid-step, his gaze locking onto mine. A warm smile spread across his face. "Rachel? What a surprise!" Mr. Randall looked between us, his confusion quickly replaced by a forced grin. "You know each other?" he asked, his tone suddenly polite. "She's my daughter," my father said proudly, pulling me into a hug. The color drained from Mr. Randall's face. "Your daughter?" he stammered. My father turned to him, his expression shifting from warmth to something much colder. "Rachel didn't mention she worked here. I suppose she's been too busy. Being disrespected?" I'd never seen Mr. Randall look so uncomfortable. He stammered, trying to explain himself. But my father held up a hand to silence him. "I've invested a lot in this company," my father said, his voice calm but firm. "But I don't invest in people who lack basic decency. Rachel is one of the strongest, most hard-working individuals I know, and if she says she's been mistreated here, I'll take my business elsewhere." "Mr. Carter, please," Mr. Randall pleaded. "There must be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," my father replied. "You've underestimated her, and in doing so, you've underestimated me." The meeting ended quickly after that. My father walked me out of the building, his arm around my shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently. "I wanted to do it on my own," I admitted. "I didn't want anyone thinking I only got the job because of you." He nodded, understanding. "I'm proud of you, Rachel. But you never have to face people like that alone." The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter, though the memory of yesterday's confrontation still played vividly in my mind. I kept replaying the look on Mr. Randall's face, how his smug demeanor had crumbled the moment my father revealed who he was. For months, I had felt powerless under his relentless belittling, but seeing him stumble over his own arrogance was vindicating in a way I never expected. I wasn't sure what would come next, but as I sat down with my morning tea, I noticed a new email notification. The sender was HR. My hands trembled as I opened it. The email began with a formal acknowledgement of my time with the company, but as I read further, my eyes widened. Mr. Randall had been demoted, and I was being offered a new position in a different department, one that not only came with a better work environment, but also included a raise. I read the email 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Relief and disbelief washed over me. I forwarded the email to my fiancé, Mike, with a quick message. "Guess who's getting promoted?" Minutes later, my phone buzzed with his reply. "You deserve it, Rach." "So proud of you." That day at work felt different. As I walked into the office, I noticed the way people looked at me, not with pity or awkward silence, but with something that resembled respect. Word had clearly spread about what had happened. I wasn't the pregnant assistant anymore. I was Rachel Carter, someone who had stood her ground. Packing up my desk wasn't as bittersweet as I thought it would be. As I boxed up my belongings, I took a moment to reflect on everything I had endured in that corner of the office. The whispered insults, the public jabs, the countless times I had doubted myself. But now, those moments felt like stepping stones, leading me to this new chapter. When I arrived at my new department, I was greeted with warm smiles and introductions. My new manager, Ms. Albright, was everything Mr. Randall wasn't: kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in my ideas. She took one look at me, noticed my belly, and said, "We're going to make sure you're comfortable, Rachel. Let me know if you need anything." It was such a small gesture, but it brought tears to my eyes. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed being treated with basic kindness. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. The tasks were challenging, but fulfilling, and for the first time in a long time, I felt valued. I was no longer weighed down by the constant anxiety of being judged or mocked. The days ahead weren't going to be easy. There was still a baby to prepare for, sleepless nights to endure, and a whole new set of challenges waiting around the corner. But for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. And that, I realized, was the sweetest victory of all.